Go with your flow.
Let's talk about life. Let's have a conversation. Let's talk about life. With love and information. Let's talk about life. And let's talk about love.
Good morning. This is Velva Lee Heraty. We're broadcasting from beautiful St. Petersburg, Florida. The show is called Let's Talk Life, and it's dedicated to personal growth, information, everything you would ever need to know about the 8 life stages, the 8 life areas, the from birth to death, and then beyond sometimes. So we cover just about everything. I'm very, very grateful that the show is sponsored by UPS. That's 2nd and 2nd Street South in St. Petersburg, Florida. It's an all-service, fully supplied UPS store. That's the heartbeat of St. Pete whenever they want to mail anything or find anything or get a mailbox or have a passport photo taken. All kinds of cool things happen there. So thank you, UPS 2nd and 2nd South. I've got a great guest today. I'm very excited. We happened to meet through a mutual friend. His wife and I are friends, and she suggested we talk. We had lunch, and it was probably it was the very first person that I've met in the last 3 years in St. Petersburg that knows about the DNA research on trauma. I remember posting it when it came out in the news. That was, I think, 2, maybe almost 3 years ago now. To me, it was headline news, and nobody seemed to pay attention to it. I think sometimes things seem to get too big and beyond people. They just don't connect dots. And since that's all I do in life is connect dots, I immediately saw the implications. Fundamentally, it means that we are not all created equal, that all the myths that we feel about starting life with a clean slate and all that is actually incorrect. And you're going to find out why, you're going to find out how, you're going to probably be upset, and we're going to talk a lot about the problem today. What's the problem? Why is it a problem? How did this happen? Blah, blah, blah. But then you're going to tune in hopefully next week and find the solutions, because we can't do both in 1 hour broadcast. It's too big. And I'm also suggesting that you get a pencil and paper right now. Just sit down or get out your iPad or whatever and just make some notes, because I'm going to, at the end of the show, I'm going to give you information on how to contact me and with questions about next week. You're going to find out the problem today. It's a universal problem that affects everybody. It's not just a select few. And nobody is safe from this. And you're going to find out what it is, how it works, what it means, and then what you can do about it, the best that you can do. Because the second part of all this groundbreaking research has not been published. It's clinical research, it's valid research, but I'm sure somewhere somebody in a research facility is researching what to do. But between my guest Jim and I, we can help you to some degree do that. And whoops, that's my phone. Better put it on silent. And so here we go. I'm going to start with my research. Years ago, I did a piece of research called Adult Children of Alcoholics. That was my service population. It was a new concept at the time. Nobody knew what it meant, what to do about it. And somebody came out with a book that was based on a fallacy. And after having so many clients with that issue, I realized the book was inaccurate. So I went to the head of the ACOA self-help community in Chicago, and I said, listen, this book and what I'm experiencing with my clients is not exactly jiving. And so we started talking about it. And I was in social work school at the time. I was doing a lot of research. I went to Dr. Pivovarsky at Loyola School of Social Work, who was the research instructor. I said, I want to research this because this book is not resonating. It turns out later I found out the book was written on actually 7 people. Her case sample was 7 people. And that upset me because it was the first book written, so everybody married it. It was the book. So anyway, that propelled me to do research on adult children of alcoholics, and at the bottom line was at the end of the research period, I had 532 respondents. So having done that, of course, research, if anybody out there has ever done it, understands that it leads to more research. So the thing that came to the top of the list in adult children of alcoholics was emotional abuse. 97% of the respondents validated that was a main concern of theirs. So, of course, what's emotional abuse? Well, guess what? I went online, and I was one of the first people to have a computer. Not one of the first people, but I was very early having a computer, so I was able to do some research. I couldn't find anything. So I remember I went to the university library, couldn't find anything. Somebody said, well, why don't you try Northwestern? So I wound up driving into Evanston and going to Northwestern Library, and I found one paper. And this is after hours and hours and hours of research. And the paper, let me see, never mind what the paper is right now, but I've got a footnote on it. And it was 2 social workers in New York who had to figure out what to do with children of alcoholics that were taken away from their parents. And this is in the past. It's the only paper. And then the Cork Foundation, Margaret Cork up in Canada, the Cork Foundation had a paper on children. There's a ton of stuff about alcoholics, but nothing about children. So I continued to research, and I finally found an article by Ann Cohen and M. Newman about, emotional abuse. I said, wow, finally, because I couldn't, it was indefinable. What did that mean? So I'm going to tell you the 5 categories that the researchers created. Emotional abuse had 5 categories. Now remember, this is emotional abuse. Rejecting, name-calling, ignoring, laughing or joking at a child, withholding attention and love, showing favoritism, and not keeping promises. That's how they define rejecting. Terrorizing behavior. Setting on such unusually high standards that when they're not met, the parents threaten the child. Active abandonment, threats of beatings, parental rages, attacking things the child loves like animals and toys, other humiliation, other terrorizing behaviors, humiliation, violence towards the spouse and siblings, and forcing terrorizing experiences on a child. And the example they used was like making them take a ride, a roller coaster ride in an amusement park. When the child's crying, it doesn't want to get on. I'm sure the list is endless on that one. The third one is ignoring. Minimization of the child's feelings, denial of the child's feelings, neglect of physical needs, lack of love and affection, not taking the child's concerns seriously, and not speaking or very inattentive to the child. The fourth one, isolating the child. This includes, but is not limited to, keeping the child at home in a room, keeping the child away from other family members, or giving so many responsibilities to the child that their relationship with their siblings cannot develop. Other behaviors are using child as an adult companion, dressing the child inappropriately for play activities and peer group activities, and overprotecting the child from normal developmental activities. I think one example that came up in my practice was one of my clients wasn't allowed to have a bicycle. I mean, every kid in the neighborhood had a bike, and they couldn't have a bike because their mother was afraid they would fall and hurt themselves. So she said, corrupting the child. This includes, but is not limited to, encouragement of self-destructive behavior, such as sex or drugs. Also encouraging to lie or cover up for parents' behavior or other reasons. Using excessive foul language in front of a child. Dressing a child precociously or provocatively. Other behaviors are taking children to R or X-rated movies, and pushing a child into dating and social roles prematurely. So those are the 5 basic categories of emotional abuse described by the author, material developed by James Scarbanino, past president of the Ericksonian Institute for Advanced Study of Child Development, probably the leading institute in the world. So, once again, rejecting, terrorizing, ignoring, isolating, and corrupting. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because as adults, my research, the big one I did, had distinct categories that separated out the one thing that separated out the adults who I put in 2 categories, main categories, recovering alcoholics and non-alcoholics. So basically we had the recovering alcoholic and the non-alcoholic ACOA. And they all ranked being emotionally abused as a child on the top of their list. But they differed in other areas. The recovering alcoholic said the top 4 rankings were an inability to express feelings, abandonment fears, and being physically abused as a child, and being angry. Now that's the recovering alcoholic ACOA. The non-alcoholic ACOA, their top 4 rankings were being overly responsible, so now you've got the codependent, the need to control, stuffing of feelings, and a sense of isolation. So 532 people took this survey, recovering alcoholics, non-recovering alcoholics. They were all children of alcoholics, adult children of alcoholics. They all agreed that emotional abuse was the top of their list. There were 9 categories they did all rank pretty high on. Being emotionally abused, these are rank ordered by the way, being overly reactive, giving undeserved loyalty to others, having a fear of authority figures, not knowing what normal is, an inability to trust, a low sense of self-esteem, an inability to feel feelings, and a lack of self-identity. Now, having had that population in my practice for over 30 years, I did this research because I didn't agree with the book. That was the original trigger. But then the primary gain, as I turned out, was, I was able to be a more effective therapist, do more meaningful interventions, focus on, the therapeutic relationship was much stronger because I knew this material. So I thought it was interesting that the alcoholic ranked being physically abused as a child, and the 4 rankings for each category were very different. So I'm just going to wrap up my research by telling you this. There were 2 categories that I think are very important, that I found to be very important in my practice. One was unfinished grief work. Children of alcoholics that have suffered at the hands of an alcoholic parent and co-alcoholic parent, there's a tremendous sense of relief when the parent dies, followed by an overwhelming sense of guilt. So they're so relieved they don't have to deal with an alcoholic parent anymore, but they feel guilty because they shouldn't be relieved. So there's a lot of internal conflict going on. And this was a huge subpopulation of this category I researched. They reported having unfinished grief work around the death of an alcoholic parent. Now, this is 44% of them. And they said they had not grieved and ranked themselves higher by at least 10%, or 16 items, that those who reported doing grief work. The top 5 items are no sense of having had a childhood, does not want to raise a family. Now, I'm never surprised when I meet somebody who's in a marital relationship that seems very strong and everything, that they're childless. I'd be honest with you, my first place I go is, hey, I wonder if they were, products of this alcoholic family. And the thing that a lot of my clients said was, hey, I already raised a family. And I call these people childless parents because they were the kids who raised their parents and their siblings. I had one client who at 7 years old was given the job of choosing the family car. So, I mean, that's crazy. We all know that's crazy. But in his family, that was normal. So they don't want to raise a family. They're attracted to people who are not there for them. And I see this in relationship issues all the time. It's so clear to me that the other person is emotionally unavailable. They're angry, and they do not know what normal is. So that's the unfinished grief work. The childless parents, sense of never having had a childhood, 85% a level of emotional abuse, taking oneself seriously, level of abandonment fears, level of guilt, need to control, and feeling different from other people. So the childless parents was one population, and the people that didn't grieve their parents, their loss of their parents, and feel guilty about it. So it's not uncommon suddenly to do grief work in the middle of about a dead parent from many years ago. It's not uncommon to suddenly find yourself doing grief work if you're working with this population. Okay, I put out my research there. If you have any questions about this, you can email me at vlhtalklife@gmail.com. You can ask me whatever you want to ask me. You can ask me questions that Jim and I will cover next week when we come back and do sort of what I call the half-assed solutions to this, because there's no hard and fast. I think the younger you work with a patient, the greater. But in my experience working with adults, it's a long road to turn some of this around. But Jim, I'm sure, has his own experiences and his own successes that, I'm unaware of at this point. So we're going to take a brief break, and then what I'm going to do is go back, introduce my guest, thank my sponsors again, and we'll see you in about 1 minute.
Let's talk about life. Let's have a little conversation. Let's talk about life. With love and information. Let's talk about life. And let's talk about love.
Okay, we're back. I'm so happy that I met Jim. I remember the lunch his wife Barbara, Jim and I had. The vitality of the conversation, the fact that we had both, it was like finding a soulmate, a psychological soulmate in the middle of a desert, because I haven't talked to many people here, hardly anyone, that is aware of some of this material and what's going on with children. And I've said a few things online, and they're not particularly welcome. So I've kind of backed off from that. Children are not my specialty, but I see the child within every adult I've ever worked with. As a matter of fact, one of their therapeutic tasks is to integrate the child, greet them, meet them, and embrace them, because they're so removed from that experience, childhood experience. So who is Dr. Jim Lewis? Well, he's a clinical neuropsychologist. He has over 40 years of experience conducting neuropsychological evaluations. He will tell you what that means. He's trained in both adult and child clinical neuropsychology. Dr. Lewis is a senior clinical neuropsychologist at Central Neurology of St. Petersburg and the Florida Children's Medical Services consultant for the Pinellas County Child Protection Team at the Suncoast Center. Now, he'll tell you what the Suncoast Center is, too. Dr. Jim has conducted over 5,000 evaluations of children and adults affected by trauma in addicted family systems, including circumstances of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, exposure to parent caregiving with alcohol and substance abuse, domestic violence, and chronic mental disorders. So he's clearly seeing the children of the population I saw as adults. Different set of children, but the idea is I'm seeing the adults, but he's seeing the children, not my children, the children. I want to make that real clear. I did my research in Chicago, Illinois with adults. He's done his work here in Florida with the children. A key focus of Dr. Jim's professional and community education has been on how to recognize and break the cycle of parents and adult caregivers unwittingly re-traumatizing their own children. Now, I'm going to throw a book out in here, and I'm sure he knows these books. It's Alice Miller, The Drama of the Gifted Child, Thou Shalt Not Be Aware. Any book Alice Miller writes, just go buy if you're interested in more about this subject. And I actually bought her shrink's book, Dr. Conrad Stuckbacher, called How to Making Sense of Suffering. So there's material out there. Now I'm starting to step on Dr. Lewis's toes, so I'm going to turn this over to him. Welcome. I'm so happy you're here.
Thanks for inviting me, Velva. I'm really glad to be here. I have to tell you all, I was so happy that Velva opened this talk with saying that these emotional abuse traumas can really affect almost anyone. Certainly children who grew up in alcoholic homes, but it's not limited to that. The same types of mental abuse that occur in the home of alcoholic families also occurring in the homes of families where there's any kind of drug addiction and mental disorders. And these are not either-ors, because it's very common that people who have either alcohol or any kind of substance abuse or drug addiction may also have a mental disorder, like bipolar or mood disorders especially. Those things often go together. So Velva asked me just to explain briefly what's this complicated concept? What does clinical neuropsychology mean? Neurologists are medical doctors who look at the structures of the brain. They do films, MRIs, CT scans. Most of you have heard of those, EEGs, to see if you have seizure disorder. What neuropsychologists do, besides community education, is that we do exams of the function of the brain, attention, memory, concentration, but also emotional functioning. I actually started out in the greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan area doing this work up until about 6 years ago. I started working down here in Florida. And at that time, the Florida Children's Medical Services recruited me through the Suncoast Center. The Suncoast Center treats mental health problems, and they also have one of the 25 or 26 child protection teams in this state. The child protection teams are the ones that get called in when there's some kind of report of child abuse and neglect. There might be a medical exam, but for a child or an adult who's in the child welfare system, often either the dependency court or the child protection team wants a brain function evaluation of a child or an adult. I've done over 8,000 of these between D.C., Maryland, Virginia, the Mid-Atlantic states, and now more so down in Florida. But one thing that keeps coming up over and over again, and I like the way that Velva talks about it, she's seeing an adult, say, at 40, but she sees the 8-year-old inside of that 40-year-old adult. I'm seeing both. I'm seeing that 8-year-old before they become the 40-year-old adult. And I'm also seeing the 40-year-old adult and see how they have brain impairment. What's fascinating, that Velva brought up about DNA, scientists have known for a long time that one of the characteristics of DNA, it is built to store information. So some of this newer information shouldn't be so shocking, but what came out is that there's some researchers that started demonstrating that trauma is affecting the brain at a cellular level, and trauma is actually stored in the DNA. That doesn't mean that you're doomed. It doesn't mean that if someone is a child growing up in a home where there's alcohol, drug abuse, mental disorder, emotional abuse, or domestic violence between the parents, it doesn't automatically mean that that child is then going to grow up and be an adult and repeat that exact same pattern. But there is an extremely strong tendency for the child who grows up in a home where the child is exposed to emotional abuse, unless that child at some point becomes aware of what's happening as an adult and does something about it, they're more than likely to repeat history.
Can I just want
absolutely jump in?
Yeah, I just want to do a further definition because I think it makes a big difference in how you're going to receive Jim's material. Abuse has 3 criteria. One is frequency, one is duration, and one is intensity. So when you think about like a death of 1,000 razor nicks, that's duration. Frequency, how often. Intensity, how strong. So I've often had clients say to me, I wish I had just been beaten up once. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, at least I could have gone to somebody and said, hey, my dad just beat the hell out of me. But instead of saying, he's the emotional psychopathological passive-aggressive abuse is much, much more difficult to define and describe by a child, but much more prevalent. Okay.
Yes, and this leads into this idea too. This emotional abuse that we're talking about, Velva brought up the example of intensity. So any person, not even growing up in an abusive home, you witness, say, a horrible car accident where people are killed. That is a single, intense, traumatic incident. That can affect you for the rest of your life, even if you have no other trauma. But what we're focusing on here is the child growing up in the home where there's really 2 forms of emotional abuse almost happening simultaneously. One is emotional abuse that is directed at the child, and other type that the child is witnessing it. And for a long time, people in the mental health field just focused on what was done directly at the child. And Velva mentioned some of these. The child is mentally injured by name-calling, ridiculing, parents who promise things and let them down, telling them that they have to do certain things that are expectations beyond what the child can experience. That's an emotional abuse directed at the child. But what we started finding is that children are emotionally abused nearly as much by witnessing it. So a child's growing up and seeing mom and dad screaming and yelling at each other, emotionally or mentally abusing each other, even physically getting domestic violence with one another. That's emotionally abusive and traumatic to the child. And also children who are seeing and in the room when their siblings are being mentally, physically, or emotionally abused. Now, some kids might, in their heart of hearts, be thinking, gee, I'm glad my big brother finally got a beating. But when it's happening, that's not how it's being processed in the brain of that child. They don't like it, and it's disturbing. So when we're looking at the concept of emotional abuse, if you're thinking about, has this happened to me? Has it happened in my family? And I'm a grown-up now, and I don't want to repeat this with my children. So we want to make sure that, that we're not going to be repeating these experiences. One of the things that can happen too, say a parent can see, say a child is very attached to something, like the family dog, the family cat, and the parent, and this is not uncommon, say the parent has gotten overly physical with the child welfare has been called in, they're told you can't be beating this child, and the parent wants to make a point with the kid, so the parent will then go hurt the child's favorite pet. We've even seen instances where parents are killing the pet, throwing a pet across the room. It's horrible and sometimes even bloody. Those children can be as traumatized and maybe even more traumatized by witnessing injury to a sibling, to a family pet, as they could be traumatized by what they directly experience through direct victimization. And how does all this play into this whole DNA issue? A lot of attention has been given to, and people hear this term and almost use it too loosely, as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Where did the concept even come from? Well, we really first learned about PTSD. I learned about it in the 70s, working with veterans coming back from the Vietnam War. Doesn't mean that World War II and Korean veterans had PTSD. It just wasn't studied back then. So we started realizing, and this takes nothing away from how terrible combat trauma can be, but children can have the same symptoms and the same devastating effects on their emotional and brain function from emotional abuse as children as combat veterans could have for a totally different reason. And this is one of the many reasons why, for example, the VA is trying to work with the men and women soldiers coming back that have PTSD. They are likely to traumatize their own children, not wittingly, not on purpose, just because they don't realize that what they're doing, how they're talking to their child, how they're talking to their wife or a domestic partner, can be affecting this child's emotional functioning. So what ends up happening is there is a cycle of abuse. I want to talk about that for a minute. There's a whole lot of examples that I could give, but I want to start with a few. One of the examples is, say, a child who is growing up exposed to alcohol, drug addiction, or mental disorder in the family. That child is being emotionally abused in those 5 ways that Velva described a little bit ago, and it just goes into the child's psyche. And as I said a minute ago, can even be stored in the DNA. That child then becomes a parent. And without realizing what they're doing, that child then starts repeating some of the same behaviors with their own children, not realizing that they're doing it. But we can go even one step further. And this is probably one of the worst issues in the cycle of abuse. Let's say a mom, not picking on the moms, but moms are the ones that get pregnant and have babies. Mom is in a home with an alcohol or substance abusing mom or dad. That mom grows up, and for whatever reason, that mom starts using alcohol or substances. doesn't know she's pregnant, conception has occurred, all of a sudden she misses a period in the second or third trimester, oops, I'm pregnant. Now, some of those moms at that point will quit drinking or using drugs, and some won't. But even the ones who quit, that baby in the womb has already had a whole trimester of fetal drug or alcohol exposure. So then what happens? Baby's born. Well, not surprisingly, what happens to those infant brains, they are going to have some kind or have a high risk for some kind of developmental or what we call a neurobehavioral problem. A neurobehavioral problem is a behavior problem that is caused by some brain dysfunction. Why is that such a big deal? So think about this. We have the mom who was in the emotional abuse cycle as a child, then is using alcohol or substances during or part of the pregnancy, and has a baby. That baby's now 2 or 3 years old. That baby is now a toddler, is more prone to attention disorders, mood and behavior disorders, learning disabilities, and the child is acting out. Mom or dad then go punish the child, call them names, smack them, hit them. So if you follow what I'm saying here, what's actually happening is that parent is punishing the child for manifesting behaviors that were caused by the fetal drug or alcohol exposure. It makes sense once you first hear it, but when I'm sitting with these moms or dads and talking about their own childhood and whether there was alcohol or drugs during the pregnancy, they really don't have any idea that they have been punishing the child for their own behaviors. In other words, the consequences of fetal drug or alcohol exposure. But it goes even one step further. So that child then grows up as a parent, has children. That parent's also a risk for reenacting the same scenes that they grew up with. Velva brought up the really excellent point of what's normal, in quotes. Normal is what you're surrounded with. Normal is how you grow up. So for some kids, normal is screaming and yelling, hitting, threatening, and then they're doing it as adults to their children. Well, guess what happens? You're punishing a child for disobedience or acting out, when in reality, that child could actually be acting out because of the disturbed environment that they're growing up in, that they're misbehaving, they're especially taking anger to school. Bad notes get sent home. Johnny got in trouble. He's out of his seat. He's punching somebody. And mom or dad then repunish Johnny for acting out in school, when in fact, Johnny's acting out because the mom and dad have an abusive environment at home with one another or with Johnny or Johnny's siblings. So you can see how easy it is for this cycle of abuse to keep repeating itself over and over again. And it's going to be great next week when we get into how do you break some of these patterns of abuse. So some of the things that come out in neuropsychological testing is that the way trauma or even alcohol or drug abuse, fetal drug or alcohol exposure, affect the brain, it doesn't affect the brain equally. What does that mean? In most children who are exposed to even fetal drug or alcohol, emotional abuse, etc., they can have many areas of perfectly normal intelligence and brain function, even above normal. So say on an IQ scale where 90 to 109 is normal, they could have some IQ scores in the 110s, 120s, even in the gifted range. But then they could have areas we call selective deficits. So the same child could have something like some verbal skill that's very gifted, but their ability to attend to and process information could be 20 or 30 or 40 points lower and have great difficulty with those things. Well, what's that got to do with emotional abuse? Parent doesn't recognize that. See a child who's very verbally bright, not only the parents but the teachers see this verbally bright child and think they should be able to do that with everything. And say that child isn't completing their homework, they're having trouble writing and copying at their desk. They have a deficit in that skill. But that's not how it's seen. The way that it's seen is, oh, you're not trying, you're lazy, you're being defiant or disobedient, when actually the child has a specific skill deficit. So that is a very common pattern in the examination of brain functions in children who grew up in abusive families, and especially children who were exposed to drugs or alcohol, to have this pattern where some skills and abilities are very normal, above average, and some are significantly impaired. And I'm speaking right now not just about the children, but about the adults that are listening to this. If you think about yourself, it's like, oh my God, I may have had an attention disorder all my life, and now I have an adult ADHD. No one's ever diagnosed it. I was just told that I was lazy and that I didn't, quote, want to focus, as if you are unwilling to focus versus unable, have an incapacity because of how you grew up, or maybe your mom or dad were using drugs or alcohol around you, or maybe you were exposed to drugs or alcohol when you were in your mother's womb. So one of the things about this whole concept of understanding this information is there's never going to be progress forward unless the adult who is, say, listening to this broadcast is going to engage in self-care. Velva brought up some of the 12-step programs. She brought up codependency. Just as an example, Codependence Anonymous is all about self-care. So people who want to grasp this information that Velva and I are discussing and put it to use to change how you are treating yourself and treating your children, that isn't going to happen if we're too hard on ourselves. If we're blaming ourselves, if we're nasty to ourselves, if we're short-tempered, if we're too perfectionistic with ourselves, that's how we're going to be with our children. So the first step is just grasping, is this happening to me? And if it is, be kind to myself. Okay, I have this. Velva talked about the problem. Do I have one of these problems? Well, if that is true, it doesn't mean we're doomed, but it means that in order to move forward, we have to be forgiving of ourselves, and even forgiving of our abusers. Forgiving of our abusers doesn't mean we forget what happens to us. Sometimes forgiving an abusive parent doesn't mean we have to hang out with them or even associate with them. Sometimes it's not even healthy. But the forgiving part means to understand, okay, these things happen. I'm not responsible for what happened to me, but I'm stuck with having to deal with how it's affected me.
I think that's a very valid point, because self-forgiveness is, in my experience, which is, over 30 years, it's, for me as a clinician and as a therapist, a signal sort of the end of therapy. When the client can, number one, understand their self-identity, understand who they truly are, not who they wish they were, or they think they were, or they were led to believe they were. And this includes occupational choices, and it's everything. You can't make one healthy decision for yourself if you don't know who you are. So self-identity is way on top of my list. But then, once you discover these things, and that includes your shadow, the parts of yourself you aren't comfortable with. But the bottom line is, you go through that process of healing. It's a transformational process. It ends in self-forgiveness, self-acceptance. I personally don't care if you forgive the abuser. I'm more interested that you forgive yourself. The abuser starts to fade into the background when you're into self-care. They're not the focus of your life anymore. They're not, your anger dissipates because they're out of your life. As a child, they were the center of your life. When you grow and thrive and claim your identity and move forward in your life, that all fades away. It seems like 1,000,000 years ago, one client said to me. But it's the idea of self-acceptance, self-forgiveness, self-identity. And for me, it sort of signals, hey, we're just about done here. And that means you have the tools to go forward and deal with your life on your terms. And I can't tell you how meaningful that really is.
And here's the part that isn't fair, but it's reality. Velva's been talking for the past couple of minutes about self-forgiveness and improving ourselves. Trauma is so significant, it can be stored in our DNA. We already said that. Emotional abuse can be so profound that we repeat it unconsciously. Those are all the bad things. Self-forgiveness is not something that is going to happen automatically. That we have to work at. We don't have to work at repeating the cycle of abuse. We don't have to work at carrying trauma around in our genes. So it isn't fair. It's like the bad stuff is almost automatic and it's going to come out, if we work on it or not. But in order to get better, the self-forgiveness part, that takes a lot of work. And a lot of the positive parts of how to break the cycle, they take awareness and they take a lot of work. So it isn't fair that we're kind of stuck with the bad stuff, but if we want good stuff to happen, we have to work our butts off and become aware and make things better for ourselves and our children. The child welfare system in almost every state. I worked with the National Model Family Court Program and taught classes for judges. This is not peculiar to Florida. It's not peculiar to the greater Washington metropolitan area that I grew up in. You can just pick up the newspaper almost any day and see another instance of some horrific form of child abuse or neglect. And we think, it's happening to everybody but in my family. But anybody who's really willing to look at themselves in a caring way can see, as Velva said at the very beginning, these things can happen to almost anybody. The more willing we are to become aware, the less likely that we're going to be repeating history. And it's unfortunate, like I said, that it's not fair. You have to work so hard at the good stuff to make it happen, but we don't have to work so hard at repeating the cycle of emotional and even physical abuse.
And that's the ordeal by fire that we all have to go through. There's thousands of books written on, healing, personal growth, and everything like that. I think they're wonderful, but in my experience, the very first task people have to accomplish is understanding who they are, having a strong sense of self-identity. That's the very first task, because you've come out of your childhood in a role. The families create a role for you. It's all unconscious. Nobody's sitting and plotting against anybody. The roles, there's the scapegoat, there's the hero, there's the abandoned child, there's the clown. There's all these family roles. In dysfunctional families, and children develop one of these roles as survival. Little Johnny learns that if he tells jokes, he can relieve the tension in the family system. And so he becomes the family clown. And, the system gets relief. The hero finds out if they bring home an A+ paper, there's relief in the family. The scapegoat, which I feel is probably the healthiest family member, because they're actually acting out and letting the larger community know something's wrong, but, they can't be read. People can't read them. They just see them as troublemakers. But they're more in touch with the truth of the family. So all these roles, the abandoned child, they just sit, they're the child that never gives anybody any trouble. But there's nobody home. When they grow up to be adults, they have no sense of self. And the rebel who has gone through the crisis, that all these roles have, their survival roles, the problem with them is they're brought into adulthood. People are still playing those roles. So the price they pay for playing the role as a survivor in a toxic, dysfunctional family for drugs, alcohol, or mental disorders is they survived. The bad news is they don't know who they are. The task of a developmental task, if you go to Erickson's 8 stages of man, the developmental task is self-identity. So I have a lot of people show up in my office, they're still in their role. And I ask them very simple, basic identity questions they cannot answer. So self-identity comes first, and then you can begin. I'm not going to go through the whole process because everybody's different. But if you don't know who you are, you can't make the choices that serve you in life. You marry the wrong person, you have the wrong career, you're developing artistic, you're not artist, but you think you are. because there's a lot of this is fallback positions. So I think it's very important in a marital choice to go into a marriage knowing who you are.
It's so interesting that Velva just brought up about surviving. We want our listeners to take in this information and have the goal of do more than surviving. The goal is to live and enjoy life. If we walk through life as victims, and I've seen thousands, what ends up happening, the most likely person to victimize someone else is someone who themselves is going through life as a victim. And unconsciously, unwittingly, that person feels like, well, I'm entitled to be mean to other people because I'm not as mean to them as my daddy or mommy was to me. And people who have been victims, who haven't dealt with it, often become perpetrators and turn around and act out abusive behaviors, not just to their children, but to, say, the server or the waitress at the restaurant or anybody, really. But we want people to do more than survive. We want to get past this and get into learning how to live and enjoy life. And that's thriving. Yes, that's going to be one of the big areas of focus in our How to Break the Cycle for our next follow-up show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that segue, because guess what? We're going to need to end. I looked at the clock. I say, oh, my God, this hour has gone by amazingly. I hope you play it 1, 2, 3 times. I hope you sit with your partner and play it 1, 2, 3 times. I hope if you're a parent, you start having a conversation about this material with your parents, your siblings. I often start when my clients are ready to claim their role in life, to claim their personal identity, and they need some historical fact-finding. They often start talking to their siblings. It's amazing how many sibships never discuss stuff like this. They talk about the parents, they talk about all the terrible things that happened, but they never talk about what they're going to do about it or how they can help each other. So your reality checks need to start, and that helps you build your. A lot of kids think they're crazy. A lot of kids think that didn't really happen because some stuff is so outrageous they just don't believe it. Neighbors don't believe it. Nobody believes it. And yet it's true. And if you deny your child's reality, you're denying your child their sanity. And nobody really wants to do that. So start thinking, start journaling, write down, hey, my first memory is. There's a lot of things you can do, and we're going to talk. I'm already into next week, and I got to pull myself back. I want to thank you for listening. I'm asking you to play this over and over again. It's going to be downloadable. It'll be on my Facebook page, but it's going to be on Velva Lee Heraty. Let's Talk Life has a Facebook page. It's going to be on there. If you miss it, email me. I will send you the link. You can email me at vlh.letstalklife@gmail.com. Believe me, my mission and Jim's mission, we're very committed to getting this material out there as far as it can go. If you're a vet, just remember, this is downloadable. It'll be findable on iTunes, but the information will start. So please listen if you can. Saturday, tomorrow. This is a pre-broadcast. Saturday at 10 a.m. Boy, the way this silly, I just said that because you can't even hear me. I'm getting so excited about this. But anyway, pay attention today. It's coming. I'll be posting it's coming tomorrow at 10 a.m. Forgive me for getting overly invested at the end here. But we will have part 2 next week. Once again, UPS, 2nd and 2nd South. Thank you very, very much for making all this possible. You don't know how big you're really contributing. I want to thank Dr. Jim Lewis, who is an amazing, well-informed, dedicated servant to healing. And I'm very happy to have met him. I want to thank his wife, Barbara, for introducing me. And thank you for listening. And remember, any questions, any concerns, anything at all, vlhletstalklife@gmail.com. Now, you can also send questions about part 2. Okay, we're signing off. And don't let me forget to thank Neil Van Ert for my fabulous, fabulous theme song, which now, of course, I'm trying to play, and I'm stuck with it. But anyway, let's see what comes up when I play it. Goodbye. Talk to you next week. Here we go.